Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Robert Steele, a former U.S. Marine CIA officer and co-creator of the Marine Corps Intelligence Center. He's author of the Open Source Everything Manifesto, Transparency, Truth, and Trust. Robert, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Max, it's a real pleasure to be back with you.
All right. Now, Robert, before we get into the open source and surveillance state issues, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on Greece. And is their crisis far worse than that of the Great Depression? Is this a security matter, Robert, in your view? What do you think?
Max, I have to tell you, the only security matter for me is a U.S. government and a U.S. banking system that's out of control. The banks made their money back from Greece long ago. What we're talking about here is collecting interest on top of interest. Greece is on the right track. Spain and Portugal should follow them. The BRICS have their own economic system coming up. The bottom line here is we need to get out of our alternative reality and join the real world.
Okay, so from what I gather, what you're saying here is that when I listen to Yanis Varoufakis, who's the finance minister of Greece, it seems like he's fighting a rear guard action, if you will. What you're saying is the banks already made their money. They're long gone. It's up. Greece now has to step up and fight for themselves. They're never going to win this game fighting the central bankers and the bankers in continental Europe. Is that a fair statement?
Max, you're utterly brilliant on point, and I had the same discussion with the central bank in Ecuador. What happens here is that the elites respond to public pressure, and I would never, ever underestimate the common sense of the public. If you look at the Nordic countries, the reason that they're so stable is that their public put in place governance with integrity, and that governance with integrity is controlling the corporations with public charters. What has happened with the banking system is it's gotten out of control. And now Greece, the elites that originally won a victory on a very clear path are now fragmenting. Some of them are being bribed. Some of them are losing their moral compass. Some of them are just stupid. And so Greece is actually backing away from the path that was correct in the first place. And Iceland is the poster child for getting it right.
Right, you say they back away from the path that was working for them. It just seemed to me that if they really were serious about negotiating a good deal, they would have let the Greek economy collapse first and then negotiate from a position of wide-scale European collapse. I just want to move on to Europe here for a second. There are several terror events in Europe by Europeans recently. Now, each one of the bad guys was already known to security services. Good example being here in the UK. They had somebody who was on MI5's radar. He went off to join ISIS, and he became the jihadi John. So your thoughts, is this because we have too much data or too many people on the terror watch list? There's not enough real intelligence? What's going on here?
Well, Max, this may be too much for you guys, but let me give you the bottom line as I see it. Number one, there is no negotiating with banks. The hell with them. Throw them out of the country, go back to public banking, okay? Period. Number two, most terrorists are false flag terrorists or are created by our own security services. Now, I have no direct access in England, but I will tell you that here in the United States, every single terrorist incident we have had has been a false flag or has been an informant pushed on by the FBI. In fact, we now have citizens taking out restraining orders against FBI informants that are trying to incite terrorism. We've become a lunatic asylum. As far as Jihadi John, the best guess that I can give you is that this is funded by Saudi Arabia, trained by CIA. This destruction of ancient artifacts and so on, that's a covert action influence operation. That's not something they would normally do. This is, in one word, largely theater.
All right, Robert, let me jump in and digress slightly, because on one hand, you're pointing out what you call harsh truths. On the other hand, you're offering up what you believe to be part of the solution. And this would get back to the open source everything manifesto. Am I correct in saying that one way to combat what you're calling false flag operations and a lot of insider skullduggery is to go open source? In other words, take all this data and make it public. So what's your view on like an Edward Snowden or Julian Assange? I mean, they have worked to open things up in a very public way. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's a good thing. But again, Max, I mean, you're one of the most sophisticated guys I talk to, and your listeners are among the most intelligent. Everything is nuanced. I mean, take Assange, for example. Assange was a good thing, but he also had Mossad connections. Snowden is a good thing, but right now all indications are that he's a CIA op that was authorized by Obama to take NSA down a notch. And the reason that the State Department canceled his passport while he was en route to Russia was precisely to throw him in front of the Russians as a dangle. So all of this stuff is complicated. Now, open source is certainly part of the solution. But more important than open source, and I want to refer to a wonderful book by United Kingdom author Peter Linebaugh, Stop Thief. And we have here in the United States another one by Richard Wolff called Occupy the Economy, Confronting Capitalism. What this is all really about is getting public morality back into play here. Ethics is monetizable. Ethics is a way of putting into operation proven forms of transaction that are above board, that are straightforward, that are not screwing the golden goose, the public that produces the productivity. So yes, open is part of the solution. But unfortunately, as long as you have governments that have no intelligence and no integrity, and as long as you have banks that are allowed to destroy economies with impunity, you are going to have suffering that will lead to jihadi Johns.
Well, you know, they used to call it in America moral hazard. In other words,
yes,
you let banks commit a little fraud here and there, but the greater good is served because we need to keep these markets open and liquid. But that moral hazard has become the de facto business plan of all major economies in the world that now thrive on what would be euphemistic or known as a kleptocracy, I think would be the closest thing. But if, you know, morality is not traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Ethics has no monetary value at all. It's a vacuum of ethics. So how do you enter ethics into this vacuum of ethics in any way that's going to have legs, it's going to have traction, because we're at the least ethical point of the history of business probably ever, Robert?
Yes, God, you're brilliant. This is, look, Michael Lewis wrote Liar's Poker in the 1980s. And recently he was asked about Flash Boys and all of the lack of ethics in the city of London and Wall Street. And he said, I never thought they'd get away with it so long. There are actually two moral hazards, maybe three. The first is the banking moral hazard. The second is that the global war on terrorism has become a business model for the United Kingdom and the United States of America. NATO exists to create elective wars and sell U.S. arms to dictators with no common sense. So I got to tell you, Max, what we have here is a world that is out of touch with what's called true cost economics. And ethics, as Will Durant says in Lessons of History, ethics is actually a major way in which you teach people from one generation to the next true cost economics really matters.
Well, also what's lost in the public discourse is this idea of philosophy, that there is such a thing as having some knowledge about knowledge itself. Now, when I listen to you, Robert Steele, of course, it sounds like you would naturally be an advocate of something that I'm going to mention, but I don't know what the answer is. But it sounds like almost you're making quite a brilliant case use for cryptocurrencies, the blockchain, and Bitcoin, but I could be wrong. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have to tell you, Max, I'm not as smart as you are about this stuff. I don't completely understand Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, but I have been calling for data at rest. And I want to make this point also. I was with Win Schwartau, who wrote Terminal Compromise and Information Warfare. Win and I and Peter Black, who's dead now, were among the first in 1988 through 1994 to call for serious attention to cybersecurity and serious attention to code that could be counted on. And we were ignored for 25 years. In fact, worse than ignored. NSA, instead of protecting communications and computing, set up all these back doors that were so infantile, they actually opened the door for hackers that were not as talented as the hackers that I know and love. And I really want to emphasize to your audience, hackers are like astronauts. They push the edge of the envelope. So I do think that crypto coin is actually a mindset, and it's a way of approaching how you handle data. And I'm totally in favor of that.
Okay, you mentioned cybersecurity. We had just recently in America the net neutrality legislation that went through. Some say it's great, others say it's a government takeover of the internet. What are your thoughts, Robert?
Well, first off, what the public hasn't seen is the secret legislation. One of the things I'm sick and tired about is secret legislation and secret side deals. The government has made some secret side deals. Net neutrality does not exist.
On a follow-up question to that, I know you're passionate about electoral reform, and there is a note here that you're running for president. I don't know what that's all about. I guess maybe you're running for president. But what's happening on the front of electoral reform, Robert?
Well, Matt, first off, electoral reform is finally about to happen. I've got a small book up that's on Amazon UK as well as Amazon US. It only costs $2.99. It's called Open Power, the Electoral Reform Act of 2015, and the Open Source Activist Toolkit. I was in Scotland at a Findhorn summit, and one of the things we realized was that, number one, the activists need a better open source way of communicating with one another and sharing. But more importantly, for the first time in history, I think I'm going to bring together the independents, the small party leaders, and the sane wings of the Democratic and Republican parties. We are going to bring together the 110 million in the United States that are at or near the poverty line, the 80 million cultural creatives, the 30 million college kids with degrees that are living at home with their parents, and we are going to jam an electoral reform act up the U.S. government's butt. And you can learn more about that at tinyurl/openpower.
All right, so, well, I think the timing is good for it, and the appetite for this is very strong, so why not? And just quickly before we sign off here, isn't it true that all these backdoor policies that are part of the technology being sold by America to these other countries, it's just horrible economics, because now these countries are rejecting the technology, and these companies are having to buy back their own stock to puff up their own earnings, because the surveillance on an economic basis is horrible, Robert.
Max, the U.S. government intelligence community, which costs the taxpayer roughly $100 billion a year. I mean, the director lies when he says it's less than that. If you add everything up, it's $100 billion a year. It is a money spending machine. It's not actually doing intelligence, which is decision support. It's spending money on technology, and NSA is processing less than 1% of what it collects. So the surveillance state is essentially morons spending money on mush. And
all right, well, we're going to have to leave it right there. Morons spending money on mush. I think that's a good description of America's surveillance state. Robert Steele, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Yes, sir.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Robert Steele. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.